Should be at the bottom.
All right.
That's it.
So Mary, you asked who is Sandra Richter, and I'm so grateful for that question because I forgot to give a caveat at the beginning of this. So the first thing is that nothing I'm saying is new or original to me. Sandra Richter is a biblical scholar who has a very accessible way of looking at the Bible as one big story. And she uses these, she uses this lens right here. And I think that's the most accessible account that I've read. A slightly more academic account, her book is called The Epic of Eden. A slightly more academic account is called The Drama of Scripture. And that's by two authors named Bartholomew and Goheen, Goheen. And then this narrative map that I have here is courtesy of Marcia Labar and her family. And so that's where I draw lots of this stuff from. All right, are there any other questions before we get started? All right, so what we're gonna do for each of these is we're going to say just the basics of when about did this happen and what books of the Bible are included in it. And then we're going to go into what it covers. And then we're going to touch basis with these three through lines with the people of God, the place of God, and the presence of God, how they evolve in this chapter. And then what questions does it leave us with as we move into the next part of the plot. So that's what we'll be doing. And it's hard for me to see all y'all while I'm screen sharing here. So if any of y'all have a question, please, I might not be able to see you, so please unmute yourself and speak up, and would love to hear from you. So we start with the beginnings, and so each of these has a symbol, and this symbol is kind of like an empty circle, which you can think of the formless and void earth that was then called into being. And so the date is, we don't know when it started, and we don't know when it ended. It covers Genesis 1 to 11. All scholars agree that these first 11 chapters, essentially, there's a natural division between them and what happens in chapter 12. In chapter 12, it starts with Abraham, which we can firmly place in recorded history. But before this is kind of considered prehistory, and it's very murky in terms of how we date these things. And so that's why in this diagram here, you'll see that there's a dotted line, because the dates aren't exactly certain. So here we have the beginnings of everything as we know it. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was a perfect work of light and beauty, culminating in the creation of men and women as governors in God's own image. Sadly, the innocence of the earth did not last long. God gave Adam and Eve one stipulation. It may seem arbitrary, but baked into it was an important idea. God is God, and they are not. If they acknowledge that, they can live in paradise with God and in his presence forever. But the first humans rejected God's authority over them and brought death into God's perfect world. What had been a blessing became a curse. The ones made to rule the earth will now rot in it. And the place that Adam and Eve were privileged to protect is now protected from them. Their children inherited their sin and continued to increase in wickedness until God saw it fit to judge the whole world by a great flood, which seemed to undo the good world that he had made. The Spirit once hovered over and brought to order the deep primordial waters of chaos. But now those waters of chaos pour forth again. But that was not the end. God chose one person to renew the call of humanity, to be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth. But once they are rescued, instead of covering the earth, the people stay in one space. Instead of honoring God, they seek to ascend to his heights and take his glory by building a tower. Maybe up there the waters couldn't reach them. So God once again brings judgment and confusion through the confusion of the languages at Babel. And so this is what we see kind of in this first act, in this first major plot point. We see the good beginnings and then how it quickly goes downhill. And in terms of the people of God, we see how it goes from all people, though at the time it only included two, but at that point it was all of humanity, goes from all people to just one person who God rescued in the form of Noah. And it goes from having paradise to paradise being lost. And in the same way, they went from being able to walk with God to being separated from him. And so the question that we're left with is that the Bible begins in a crisis. How will God rescue the people he loves from the death they persist in choosing? That's a question that we're left with here. Are there any other things that stand out to y'all in terms of this chapter as you think about this as a drama, as a narrative? It's hard to go back to a place where you don't know what you already know. But what are the questions you feel like you're left with as we reach the end of this chapter? Like what's going to happen next? Or where do you feel tension or something unresolved?
Where and how did Satan enter this situation?
Yeah, great question. Wish I could answer it.
I mean, was he there before? Had he rebelled against God and fallen to the earth before Adam and Eve were created?
Yeah, so in at the later point in the Old Testament, in the development of the Jewish theological thought, like that becomes an idea that you see alluded to obliquely in one of the prophets. I believe, I think there's a more concrete story about it at some point in the Apocrypha, which we don't hold to be the inspired word of God, but still valuable for some aspects of instruction. But what we're left with, I would say, when we look at where did evil come from, is we can try to take that small bit of evidence that we have elsewhere in the Bible, and we can try to think logically about what might have happened. But if you look at the biblical witness itself, it doesn't, as you read Genesis 3, it doesn't treat that as a question that's worth answering. In the sense that it's saying, the author is saying, this isn't the main question I want you to have. Though obviously it is a huge question that we all have. And that's why there has been a lot of theological debate about it, because it's something that's not exactly clear.
So you're saying there isn't an answer?
I would say there's not. I would say there certainly isn't a definitive answer. Mm-hmm. That would be my 2 cents.
Okay.
Well, other than we know it was in the garden, it took place in the garden.
I mean, yeah, but like, how did
it fall?
Yeah.
So, but other than that, I would say.
Yeah. So that's what we have in the beginnings. And so we go from the beginnings to the patriarchs. And in the patriarchs, we have, this is where we can start to firmly date things that based upon archaeological evidence and based upon the customs that are described in the narrative of Abraham and things that are going on in the larger area, we can put that at around 2000 BC. And the end of this, there will be a debate about when that ends, and we'll get into that once we get into the next chapters, why there's a debate there. But that is much less interesting than the story itself. And this part of the Bible is from Genesis chapter 12 to the end of that book. And here's what we read about the patriarchs. We have, after these collective dealings with all of humankind, God decided to single out one man, Abraham. And God promised Abraham offspring and a land, a renewed vision for the people of God and the place of God. And Abraham leaves everything he knows and everything that could bring him security in order to follow where God was leading him. But Abraham struggles to trust God's provision as he roams foreign lands. And at one point, he doubts God's promise of offspring and takes matters into his own hands. But God does not give up on Abraham. Sooner would God be cut to pieces than forsake his promises. Eventually, Abraham and Sarah do conceive, and Abraham trusts God with his son's very life. And his sons and grandsons, in their own ways, struggle to trust the promise that they had received from their father. They struggled to believe that it could be true for them as well. Isaac, like his father, did not trust God in a foreign land, and Jacob deceived others in order to get his own way. But God repeated these promises to each of them and even renamed Jacob Israel. And Jacob's sons would become the 12 tribes that would eventually form the nation of Israel. But Jacob's sons continued the trend of their forefathers, committing adultery, treachery, and murder. They even sold their own brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt. And so if we look at the through lines here, we see that the people of God has expanded from one person to a whole family. And we see that God has promised a place for his people to dwell in. But the presence of God is still a mystery. We still don't know how God is present to his people. God has called Abraham and spoken to him, but hasn't dwelled with him or made himself present to Abraham like in any way like he was in the garden. And so as we come to the end of this chapter, some of the questions that come to mind, well, how could such a ragtag family live into such a great promise? How could such a bunch of folks who struggle to trust God, how could they be the ones who inherit a land and become a blessing to the whole world? And we're also left with this question of what's going to happen to Joseph? Is he going to be okay down in Egypt? And so that's a question that we have at the end of this chapter. I'm going to speed us up here to the next one, unless if any of y'all have, if you think of this as a story, if you think of this as like reading it to a child or grandchild, and perhaps sometimes you might ask them like, what do you think is going to happen next? Or something like that. Like that's what we're trying to think of right now in terms of what is going to happen next.
So why are the women being left out of the narrative? They're matriarchs too, Sarah and Rachel and Leah.
Yeah, so they are in the narrative, what one are you talking about in this summary, or just in the Bible?
Yeah, in that thing that you read, it doesn't mention any of the women. That's kind of irritating.
Yeah, that is a fair point. And they are obviously mentioned and named in the Bible. I think in general, that's a complaint that we can have about this part of the Old Testament, is why are the women excluded? Like it seems like it's all about the men who are the ones who drive the plot, who drive the conversation. This might not be a satisfying answer, but at that time it was a patriarchal culture. And this is something that Sandra Richter talks about, is that what was true of the patriarch would have been true of the matriarch. And so even though the main plot follows the men of the story, the women are fully included based upon the cultural logic of the time. And we even see ways, as you well know, of Plana, in which women are unexpectedly given great prominence. For instance, in Hagar, who is the first person to name God. She calls God the God who sees me. And she's the first person in the Old Testament to give God a name. And so you are well within your rights to call me out on that.
Seeing as how God's people kept making a mess over and over, I'd just as soon leave it up to focusing on the men. But we know women can make it messy too.
Yeah. Yeah, and unfortunately, sin does not discriminate. So from there we go to Egypt. And this is where we get some conflicts with dates. There are two schools of thought in terms of, did this happen starting around 1800 BC or 1650 BC? And those essentially are the early or the late date for the Exodus. The long and the short of it is the early date depends on the accounting of years used in the Bible, which oftentimes in the conventions of the day were highly figurative, and so perhaps might have not always been intended to convey literal dates. But if you go with those, that gets you to 1800 BC. And if the later dates are based upon archaeologists who've looked at the circumstances that are described in the Bible, when they line up with what we knew was happening in Egypt, for instance, there is a well-documented evidence of lots of Semitic people coming to Egypt in around in the 17th century. And so that's why those people would, that's why lots of scholars would say, hey, we would actually date this more around the 17th century in terms of the arrival in Egypt. And the books that we're talking about is the latter half of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And what happens here is God blessed Joseph in Egypt, and he rose to prominence as the vice regent of the whole country. When famine hit the region, the rest of Joseph's family came to Egypt for food and were welcomed by Pharaoh just to settle there. Not only did God not forget Joseph, he worked the evil of Joseph's brothers out for their own salvation. They did not perish in the famine. And the family of Israel increased greatly in Egypt. But in time, a new Pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph. Afraid of the strength of the Israelites, he subjected them to forced labor and commanded that their newborn sons be drowned in the Nile. However, one couple hid their son in a reed basket, where he was discovered by Pharaoh's own daughter and rescued. He grew up in the royal household, but after committing murder, fled to exile in the desert, where he remained for 40 years. And so we see here that God's people grow in number, but their scope remains the same. And yet it seems that they've gone farther away from the land that was promised them. The tension builds in terms of God, it seems, is taking care of them in Egypt, yet they seem to be farther from where they had started in terms of what the goal was. And still, God is nowhere to be seen in terms of his presence among his people. And so the question that this chapter of the narrative leaves hanging, the tension that it leaves, is how will God's people escape the most powerful regime in the region on earth at this time? And has God forgotten his people? Those are some of the pregnant questions that we're left with here. And next we have the Exodus, which I forgot to change the dates on this one as I was scrambling to put this together, but that bottom date would be around the date that we're looking at for the Exodus, 1446 or around 1250, depending upon if you look at the early or the late. And I forgot to update this as well. It's yeah, so this is the remainder of the book of Exodus. But God heard the cries of his people, and in fact has not forgotten them or his covenant that he made with Abraham. God saw his people and he knew their affliction. So God cries out to Moses from a burning bush in the desert and commissions him to save God's people. Moses and his brother Aaron told Pharaoh to let Israel leave Egypt so they can worship their God. It took 10 plagues to convince Pharaoh that God was serious, but on the night of the first Passover, Israel was liberated. God led his own people through the Red Sea, where he finally triumphed by drowning the same people who had drowned his own people. And not only were the Israelites freed, but a mixed multitude came out with them. Thus, Israel is rescued from a strong enemy against whom she had no defense. The people are delivered from slavery and poverty and returned to a place of security, given an identity, a future, a hope, and an inheritance. Israel is redeemed, and this becomes the most important event in all of their history, as it's how God will time and time again introduce himself to his people. And so we see here that the scope of God's people has increased in some way, that there are folks who aren't the nation of Israel who've come out with them, who saw what God was doing in the plagues and said, I want to be with God. And I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to put the blood on my doorpost too, and I'm going with them. And so somehow the scope of God's people in part has increased. And we see them moving closer to the land of promised. And here we have God has made himself present, but to an individual on a one-off basis in the burning bush. And so we have a hint of God's presence, but still nowhere near like what we had in Eden. And so the questions that we're left with is, like, what great thing will God do next? If this is what God can do to rescue his people from the most powerful nation, is there anything that could stop them? And yet, unfortunately, we find out very quickly that in fact, there is. So the wilderness period, once again, we have variations here based upon which date you take for the Exodus, but it's about 40 years. And it runs the rest of the book of Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch as well. And in the wilderness, a mnemonic that you can use is that Joseph, got people down into Egypt, and Mo, as in Moses, got them out. But once they got out, people of Israel found themselves in a barren desert. Here, God miraculously provided them with water, bread, and meat. But the route from the Red Sea to Canaan would only take 1 month from Sinai. But the people's rebellion in the wilderness necessitated a 40-year stay while the Exodus generation died out. And while it only took a few days to get God's people out of Egypt, it took 40 years to get Egypt out of God's people, who often thought things would be better if only they could go back to how good they had it in Egypt. And during this time, God fashioned this ragtag group of former slaves into his own people by giving them his law, a calendar of feasts, and the tabernacle. The law created the structures of the nation by defining what the Lord requires of them. The calendar organizes their time in terms of a weekly Sabbath and annual feasts, which remind them of the larger story that they're a part of. And the tabernacle enthrones God as their king within their midst. God was making Israel into a great nation, and now it is one that has God as the true king. And so we see here that God's people have grown from just a clan of Abraham to a whole nation. And we've seen that they've have journeyed from the wilderness, have been eventually will eventually make their way onto the doorstep of the land of promise. And now we have, and for the first time, God has made himself present to his people again. He instructs them to build a tabernacle so that he might dwell with him. But this presence is painfully incomplete. For while God is once again dwelling with humanity, humanity is still separate from God. For only the high priest can go into the place where God dwells, and only once a year. And so though God is once again with his people, it's on a limited basis. And the questions that were left is, what would happen once the people eventually got out of the wilderness into the land? And then we have conquest. So I forgot to say what all these things are. So the pyramid is obviously Egypt. This, what looks like bacon with dots in between, is supposed to be an aerial view of the Red Sea being parted. Those are the 2 tablets, and this is a sword for the conquest. So once again, we have a range of dates here that vary depending upon when you think the Exodus happened. But in terms of where it happens in the Bible, it's the entire book of Joshua and the first couple chapters of Judges. And here in the conquest, we read that though Moses was the greatest prophet of the Old Testament, he was only permitted to lead Israel to the border of Canaan. The task of conquering fell to Joshua. Joshua was a faithful leader, strong, courageous, and obedient to God. The people gave him their full allegiance, but the conquest is not a simple matter of those with Israel versus those in the land. The angel of the Lord is on neither the side of Israel nor the side of the Canaanites. He is for those whom are with God. Therefore, Rahab and her family in Jericho, by trusting in God, are spared. Whereas the Israelite Achan and his family, by not trusting in God, suffer the same fate as the Canaanites. After many successful battles later, the land belonged to Israel and was distributed between the 12 tribes. And this is why at the end of the book of Joshua, it takes 12 chapters of just saying what the boundaries of the land are that we don't care about at all and think, man, that is so boring. But the reason why it takes up so much space is because this is the fulfillment of this promise that had been percolating for so long. And so the people are overjoyed by this great advancement in the narrative. And so we see that there's this hint, this foreshadow, this taste that people who aren't Israelites can be included in God's people. We see that with Rahab. And we see that the land is taken. They at last are in the land that has been promised. And as they do this, God goes before them. God is not just with them in his presence, but he's going before them in battle. And so those are the developments that we have there. We have 4 more chapters that I'm going to try to get through real quick here, but I know we just did a few, so I want to stop and pause if there are any quick questions that folks have. All right. So next is Judges, and this is supposed to be a downward spiral. And Judges, we still have this variation of when it starts, and I had a typo there. That's the end date is supposed to be 1020 BC, not 1200. And we read about it in Judges. The book of Ruth takes place in this time period, and Samuel is the last judge, so we see him there as well. And so in Judges, we see how the death of Joshua leaves a crisis of leadership. A generation arose that forgot the Lord and the work that he had done for Israel. The people fell into a cyclical pattern. They served idols, and God made them subject to a foreign power. When they cried for rescue, God sent a judge to deliver them. But when they were rescued, they fell back into idolatry over time, and their faithfulness to God deteriorated, so that the cyclical pattern turned into a downward spiral until everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so this resulted in the people of God looking and acting just like the Canaanites whom they had replaced. But the last judge was a faithful prophet named Samuel. And so we see here that it's the same people involved, and they're trying to get settled in the land, but they're encountering a bunch of difficulties. And in this time, in the period of Judges, the tabernacle has gone MIA. The ark, which played such a strong central role, is only mentioned once, elliptically, at the very end of the book. And the question that leaves us with, what is going to take these people out of this downward spiral? And the answer is a king. And so the time of the kings goes from 1020 BC to, and here we have 2 end dates. The first is 720 BC, and the second is 586. And that's because the kingdom splits in 2, and they are done away with at different times. So the books we have involved here are 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. And it's easy to get these confused. Essentially, the for 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they both cover the kings, but the Chronicles only covers the southern kingdom, the people of Judah. And it's kind of like written after the fact, more of trying to make sense of what happened, whereas the book of Kings covers both north and south. And the book of Kings starts with Solomon, and Samuel ends with the end of David. And what happens here is the people have grown tired of anarchy and invasion and thought that having a king would solve their problems. If they had a king who could rally a unified army, then they would be safe from their foes. If it worked for other nations, why wouldn't it work for us? But the role of foreign oppression and the covenant that was issued at Sinai was for disciplinary purposes. It was supposed to bring Israel back into right relationship with God. Hence, the solution of foreign oppression was not a more effective military. It was an adherence to the covenant. Therefore, even though God had said through Moses they would one day have a king, wanting it the way they did amounted to a rejection of God as their king. And this is something that we do in our lives often as well, which because how things work now, not all hardship in our life is evidence of sin or is evidence that we're departing from God. But oftentimes we think that what we most need is something that is not God. And granted, we often do need very physical and material and intangible things, but oftentimes we think, man, if only I had this one thing, my life would be better. I find myself doing that same thing as well. But despite this, God told Samuel to grant their wish. And the king that they wanted was Saul, who was tall and strong, perfect for mustering an army. But Saul did not obey the Lord. So God replaced Saul, the people's king, with David, his king. And David was short, not physically intimidating, overlooked for the role of a king. But God chose a king who would follow him. And David did. Early in his reign, he asked to build a house for God that is a temple. But God said he would build a house for David, as in a dynasty. David fought bravely and gave Israel rest from their foes, not by his military might, but as a result of his devotion to God. And David's son after him, Solomon, was the wisest man who ever lived. He built the temple at Jerusalem. And under his rule, Israel flourished in wealth with justice and arts flourishing as well. Yet sadly, Solomon's son was a fool who split the kingdom in two. The northern 10 tribes governed from Samaria were called Israel, and the southern 2 tribes were called Judah. And so in terms of the developments we have here, we have another foreshadowing where under Solomon, the nations, they aren't included in the people of God, but they come to see what God is doing. The Queen of Sheba comes to see what is this amazing thing that Solomon has going on. And we see not only are the people in the land of promise, they finally have rest from their enemies. And instead of having a tabernacle, we have a temple. Whereas before God had dwelt with his people in a tent, as his people were mobile, now he dwells with them in a building, as his people have settled in the land. But just like the tabernacle was limited, so is the temple. And the pregnant question that we're left with is, could these 2 kingdoms ever be unified again? And then we go into exile. We see these handcuffs here as a symbol of the people going away into exile. And so the dates of this are 586 BC to 538. 586 is when Jerusalem is overthrown, though in 609, you have the first deportation of people to Babylon, but it happens in full in 586. And in these books, we have books like Ezekiel and Daniel and Esther. And after all of Israel's kings turned out to be wicked, despite the ministries of Elijah and Elijah, the people did not repent of their idolatry and were finally destroyed by Assyria. Judah had 20 kings, but only 8 of them served the Lord. And as the years go by, the storm clouds continue to gather on the horizon. And people would start to ask the same question: is there a son of David out there who can clean up the mess that we've made and stand up against our enemies and speak up for the voiceless. But the sons of David, these kings, they continue to disappoint. And after years of warnings and second chances, the covenant curse is at last enacted, and Judah is swept away. However, God preserves a faithful remnant of his people. And here we have a great tragedy. The people of God are dispersed and they're subjugated. They're captives. Not only are they captives, they're captives in a foreign land far away from the land of promise. Yet there remains a glimmer of hope. Ezekiel, while he's in a foreign land, has an amazing vision of how God is still there with his people and how God is still at work. And so while it seems like God is not present with his people in a mysterious way, he still is on the move. And so the question that we're left with is, if only we could have a champion, if only we could have a king like David, perhaps we could once again find peace. We're left with wondering, how could these people be brought back? And then lastly, we have the return, which is from around 537, which is when Cyrus issues the decree for the folks to go back to Jerusalem, until about 400 BC is towards the end of the time of Nehemiah. And we have books like Ezra and Nehemiah, and we also have some prophets that are set in this time as well. And what we see here is that the prophet Jeremiah foretold that the exile of Judah in Babylon would last 70 years. And faithful Daniel trusted this prophecy and from exile prayed for deliverance. God hears his prayer and delivers Judah, but by the hand of Cyrus, king of Persia. And God's people returned to their land in waves. First, Zerubbabel began the work of rebuilding the temple. Later, Ezra, the priest, returned to Jerusalem to reacquaint the people with God's law. And finally, Nehemiah returned and led the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was restored, but it lacked its former glory. From this point onward, Israel would remain a subject people of a foreign king. And so here we see the people are regathered, but they're still dispersed, because in the heyday of Jerusalem before exile, you had about 250,000 people who lived there. But in the return, only about 20,000 people came back. So while the people are back, it's not the same amount as what was before. And they're back home, but home is no longer their own. It's governed by someone else. And they once again have the temple, but the temple does not have the presence of God. When the Temple of Solomon was dedicated, it talks about how the presence filled the place. But when this new temple was dedicated, nothing happened. And not only that, it was way smaller. So depressing was it that Ezra talks about how there were some of the elders who had seen the first temple, who were there when the new temple was being built, and they wept at how pathetic it was in comparison to what they had lost. And so the question that we're left with, the question that we're left hanging with at the end of the Old Testament is, can home be home again? Can the land of promise once again become the land of promise? And could God actually come and dwell with his people when it seems like they are forgotten and they are under the thumb of a foreign country? They're back home, but it doesn't feel like they're back home. And so these are just supposed to be the major plot points of what happens over the course of the Old Testament. And what the hope is if we have a good sense of what all of these are, we can go back and then see the through lines that run all throughout the story. And that, for me, is where the magic happens. And so I apologize that this has been such a fire hose. I'm sorry that it was not more engaging, but I was trying to get through as much of it as we could. And but before we close, I want to open the floor for any comments or questions or rude remarks, which is what Bible study leader of mine in high school would say. I've also have heard someone now say, as a joking way, add like, or any words of knowledge to include as well. But
well, I want to thank you, Father Michael. I appreciate the presentation. In another life, I was a lawyer, and I always liked points A, B, and C, D, E, and you presented it very, very well. And I like the context in which it was presented: people, place, and the presence of God. Whenever I look at the Old Testament or the Bible as a whole, I always say to myself, I'm not sure I would have done it that way, God. But that harkens back, Father Michael, to what you originally said. And that is, God says, I am God and you are not. And I think in our Christian walk, that is probably the biggest question that we wrestle with, and the biggest thing that we need to understand. He is God and we are not. So I appreciated your presentation, and I was actually viewing the entire presentation with that in mind. I am God and you are not. And I would think that was the answers to every question after each era. I am God, you are not. I have a plan. So anyway, that's my comment.
thank you, Susan.
So one of the areas where it gets confusing for me is during the eras of the kings, the exile, and the return.
Mhm.
Are all of the different books of the prophets in no particular order, and that gets very confusing. And that's just a comment I wanted to throw out there as to why I think people get confused with the Old Testament. After the Pentateuch, Joshua, and the Judges, it's not really in chronological order anymore, and you have all the books and the prophets all over the place, and I know that confuses me. So I really appreciate this linear explanation.
Yeah, it's tough because once you the way that the Jewish scriptures are organized, the last book of the old of their scriptures are chronicles, and so because that's them trying to make sense of how did we get here. And it ends with all the genealogies, which is in part why Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, begins with all the genealogies. But yeah, the way that we have it's all tidy until you get to the end of Nehemiah, and then you're like, oh my gosh, how do things fit? And I could send you a chart that has like where all the prophets fit, because it's the challenge of not only is this figurative and poetic, so it's hard to understand on its own right, it's like, when is this happening? It gets tricky.
Father Michael, I just say that I wish I'd had this overview before I had read the Bible through the very first time. It would have been very helpful, because it is confusing, and keeping the two different kingdoms, Judah and Israel, straight throughout the Kings and Chronicles is, I got it now, but when I first read through, it was very confusing. And so I got lost, I couldn't see the big picture for it, all the details that were thrown at me. So thank you. I'm glad to have this clear cut, as clear as it can be, overview. So
Mhm.
I can't wait to read the Old Testament through the next time.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could send us that that you talked about with the prophets and everything, that would be, I would be interested just in having that resource.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
I was particularly taken with how you described the presence of God, or the lack of the presence of God, as the Old Testament went along. That was fascinating.
Mhm.
If he would, how he showed himself at different stages of the history.
Mhm.
And I'll be looking for that the next time I start reading in the Old Testament. How close was he? How far away was he at those points?
Yeah, like it's the key word is to dwell. He says in the tabernacle, God tells them to make it so that he can dwell with them.
Yeah.
And then that of course in John 1, when it says that he dwelt among us, the Greek word for there is tabernacle. He was the tabernacle among us.
Mhm.
And so he was the hope that this tabernacle had been pointing to, of God actually dwelling with his people.
Really interesting.
I have a question with regard to that.
Mhm.
You always hear, and I do, and I believe, and I see in the Old Testament, all the signposts that point to the Messiah, to Jesus,
Mhm.
but it's not mentioned at all in this. You said this was Marsha Labar's. She had come
Yeah,
up
so
with this
what
narrative map.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what, I mean, like I said, like I bit off a lot more than I could chew here. I think what ideally you would do is do a review of the plot points in a much more quicker way, especially since y'all have, with this audience, you have a good background knowledge of what those plot points are. And then you can go back and look at how do main themes recur over the course of the whole Bible. And that's where you'll see things more like what you're talking about, both in terms of prophecies, but honestly, in the New Testament, it happens more so in something that's called types, which is kind of, if you imagine a picture that's super blurry and you can kind of tell what it is, but you can't make it out. And then you see like a picture that's been enhanced or sharpened. That is kind of what lots of things in the Old Testament are compared to what happens in the New Testament. So we have not only prophecies, but also those types, those pictures like that. Yeah, so I think so the two things I think about when I think about this story is when I see the story of God as being about God trying to create a people for himself to be in his place, enjoying his presence. That gets me excited, and it helps shape kind of my longings and what I'm aiming for, because it's very easy for me to start to act as if the story of my life has a different end. And so as I remind myself of this story and these through lines, it helps me in the morning remember, like, what am I here for, or what am I doing? And so that, I think, is something that we can think about as well, as like, how do we see ourselves in this story as well? But that's all that I have. I will pray, and if anyone wants to hang on, they're welcome to, as long as they'd like. So please pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you that ever since we first sinned in the garden, have continued to sin since then, that you have pursued us, because what your design from the beginning was that we would get to be your people who lived in the place of your making with your very presence. And so as we look at this story, that not just that you have written in a book, but you have enacted in history, God, may that shape our hearts to long to be your people and to long to live with you. Please use this to shape, God, how we see our own lives in terms of who we are and where we are going. Jesus, we ask this in your name. Amen. All right.
Thank you. It was
That's
great.
great.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you, Father Michael.
Good night.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
See ya. I'm going to hang on, Michael, and see if it'll come back to me to where I can, will download the video.
Oh, you want to stop recording?
I can stop it.